Check your mic.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we can put these are fancier. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Asma, Michael Asma.
Hi, Michael. How are you? Thank you so much.
He's the real boss in here, by the way.
He's the boss.
Hello, Michael. Ça va? Ça va?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Okay. So Ahmed should tell us when she
يلا قبل شوي.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We will be discussing human rights and citizenship in the Arab Gulf states. The Arab uprisings that started in 2011 have intensified debates over the meaning of citizenship, the rights and responsibilities that go with citizenship, and relations between citizens and states. These debates exist in the Gulf too, although perhaps less loudly than in countries undergoing transition. Gulf governments have continued to define different de facto levels of citizenship, determining who is entitled to which levels of economic benefits on the basis of ancestry, who is entitled to vote, whether women can pass citizenship on to their children, and in some cases even stripping citizenship from descendants perceived as being disloyal. Today we have a set of distinguished speakers to discuss and comment on the topic of citizenship and human rights in the GCC. We will hear now from Tor Hodenfield from Civicus, who will speak about the political and civil rights of citizens as well as their legitimate civic space within the boundaries of international conventions.
Thank you so much, Asma, and thank you everyone for weathering the storm and joining us today. Looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. As Asma mentioned, I work for an organization called Civicus, which is a global alliance of over 4,000 civil society groups, which works to promote civic space and citizen action across the world. What I hope to do today is provide some context about the civic space situation in the Gulf region. My co-panelists will be discussing the parameters and the catalyst for denaturalization and the revocation of citizenship in many countries in the Gulf. And one thing that Civicus has identified is that one of the main drivers of decitizenship and denaturalization is government's attempts to restrict and suppress democratic dissent in civil society. Governments across the Gulf are conflating the ability and the will to advocate for human rights with being anti-state and with being anti-regime. On the contrary, civic space is a key element of citizenship. it is almost impossible to disentangle people's rights to civic participation with their role as citizens. It is integral and elemental. So what I'm going to do for the next 5-7 minutes is discuss the specific challenges for civil society to exercise their democratic freedoms, including assembly, association, and expression in the Gulf region. I'll be doing this using a new tool developed by Civicus called the Civicus Monitor. As you'll see on the screen behind you, this is the landing page for the Civicus Monitor. It's an online platform which tracks civil society space in 195 countries in the world. It can be found on Civicus's website. So I'm going to briefly discuss some of the global trends before going into the specifics of what's happening for civil society in the Gulf. Without boring you too much, just very briefly on the methodology of the Civicus Monitor. The Monitor uses a robust methodological process in which we use that data from primary sources, secondary sources, and most importantly from civil society organizations. One of which is the Gulf Center for Human Rights, which is one of Civicus's key regional partners, which informs the Civicus Monitor. So as you'll see on the screen behind you, what we've done with the Monitor is try to provide a color-coded explanation and exploration of civic space in every country in the world. There's a broad metric that goes from the most disenabling environment for civil society, which is closed, which is the colors in red, all the way to light green, which are the colors that you'll see primarily in Europe, some in Africa, and Latin America. The global context for civil society is not particularly enabling. From our research, we found that 108 countries in the world live in environments where civil society is either closed, repressed, or obstructed. So in these 108 countries, civil society activists and HRDs and protesters do not have adequate space that is also safe to exercise their fundamental citizenship rights. Worryingly, this reflects about 3% of the world's population. So only 3% of the world's population live in countries that have an open civic space. From our research, we can see that some of the primary drivers of restrictions on civic space are detention and attacks of journalists and excessive use of force against protesters. This does not mean that other tactics and strategies by governments and the private sector are not being used in terms of legislation, harassment, and censorship, but from our research, the most common forms of repression in civil society across the world are currently detention, attacks on journalists, and excessive use of force against protesters. So before getting to the Gulf, I think it's important to underscore that there are quite significant disparities in this space for civil society across different regions. You can't see maybe necessarily the numbers behind you, but the vast majority of countries in Africa and in Asia are what we'd call closed or repressed or obstructed. This does not mean that Europe is not immune from civic space restrictions. Many, at least 20 countries in Europe are also considered obstructed out of 50 countries that are identified in Europe. But you can see that there are significant differences across the region. And particularly in the Gulf, this is the crux of our discussion today, you will see that the situation is quite dire across the Gulf, the 10 countries that we have focused on in the Gulf region. The vast majority, as you'll see, of countries in the Gulf are considered closed by Civicus, meaning that there is almost no space whatsoever to exercise one's civic rights. There are 3 countries that are considered repressed and only 1 that is considered obstructed. How does this compare to the rest of the world? So 70% of countries in the Gulf are considered closed for civic space, as compared to 10% in the rest of the world. 30% of countries in the Gulf are considered repressed, as opposed to 17 in the rest of the world. And there's not a single country, according to the Monitor, that has an open environment for civil society. What are the key trends for civic space restrictions in the Gulf region? Worryingly, it is the complete closure of civic space across many countries, where their civil society has been forced to relocate and are completely criminalized to the point of not being able to advocate publicly without severe fear of repercussions and persecution. There's also the growing use of anti-terrorism legislation, travel bans, targeting of activists, and of course the revocation of citizenship. I think others on the panel will talk about this more in depth, but we do know that the revocation of citizenship is being used as a very potent tool across the Gulf to persecute activists. Over 500 activists in Bahrain, 500 individuals, including many activists in Bahrain alone, have had their citizenship revoked, which gravely undermines their ability to advocate for human rights norms and obligations in the country. We can look, of course, at specific trends in each country in the Gulf. There's more information on Civicus's website. I think it is important to note, specifically in Kuwait, that about the arrest and detention of defenders advocating for the rights of the Bedouin community is a pressing and concerning issue across Kuwait. And there is more information on the website on particular country developments in each region. But I would like to end briefly on some more encouraging reflections, is that despite these restrictions, there is still, and are still, a number of civil society actors who are operating across the Gulf. There is mobilization, there is public advocacy, and more private and coordinated mobilization across the sector in the region. There are groups that must be supported in the country. They do exist, and they are on the front lines and doing very, very important work. So the fact that the country is closed does not mean they should be neglected or forgotten. On the contrary, it means we must increase our support for activists across the Gulf. That their solidarity and support from the international community, including the UN, is particularly important given the restrictions nationally and the very narrowed avenues for collaboration with the government and dissent at the local level. The international community becomes increasingly vital to supporting HRDs on the ground. There are a number of examples of successful campaigns, including Saudi Arabia with the I Am My Own Guardian campaign, which we know has not been implemented yet, and we're hopeful that it will be. This is just one example of why it's important to support civil society across the Gulf. I'll leave it there and hand over to my colleagues, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Tor. I'm personally very happy with your intervention. Quite useful and important information you've provided for us. There are both political and civil society activists seeking to counter sectarian and ethnic tensions and to develop a more inclusive notion of citizenship. Whether this takes the form of campaigning for political reforms and a constitutional monarchy, or more of a social movement focused on building up social solidarity and trying to develop a longer-term change in attitudes. Tara Rayner O'Grady, on behalf of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, will share her thoughts on this, and I know we would be happy to hear her experience on this as an international campaigner for human rights, whom I personally have known since 2011.
Thank you, Asma. It is an honor to be here today on the panel. I'm going to broadly discuss this issue from more of a political, socio-economic perspective, and I'll make some notes at the end with regards to my own experiences interviewing people who are internationally displaced from the Gulf region. But most Gulf states have stateless residents, known as bidun jinsiyya, I hope I pronounced that properly, which basically means without nationality, many of whom are descended from parents who did not obtain passports when these were introduced in the last century by colonizers. Whether because they did not understand their importance, especially common amongst illiterate people, or because of deliberate discrimination. The problem is particularly acute in Kuwait, which has an estimated 120,000 approximately bidun residents, largely excluded from state services or even the ability to register a marriage. The authorities contend many are illegal immigrants from Saudi Arabia or Iraq posing as bidun, while bidun activists say they are mostly our original residents of Kuwait. The power to grant citizenship has also been used by rulers, for instance in the UAE and Bahrain, to help to resolve the status of children born to mothers who are nationals but fathers who are not. In most GCC countries, citizenship is passed through the father, meaning women who marry foreigners are penalized by seeing their children unable to benefit from the free schools, healthcare and later job opportunities reserved for nationals. The UAE has begun, the Gulf states in the Arab Uprisings 53, to change this legislation, passing a decree in 2011 that children in this situation could apply for citizenship once they become 18, which is helping to make the legal notion of citizenship somewhat less gendered. In the meantime, rulers have also granted nationality to some of the children facing these issues. In Bahrain too, the king has given citizenship to hundreds of children in the same situation, something long advocated for by the Supreme Council of Women, a Quango or quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization headed by his wife Sheikha Sabika. He has also given nationality to hundreds of former Bidun people. In both cases, the ruler has directly addressed issues that have caused human rights concerns, albeit through one-off decrees rather than institutional change. Unfortunately, in direct contrast to this, as forementioned by Tour, hundreds of Bahraini citizens have had their citizenship revoked and have been deported and now living as refugees in exile. Long taboo in the GCC, the definition of nationality is very clear among Gulf states, but there is still little consensus on the meaning of citizenship. There is question around whether lifting citizenship rules will benefit GCC governments, economies and the people that live in the region. Although Saudi Arabia already has, at least on paper, a pathway to citizenship, no GCC countries are realistically considering easing their citizenship restrictions legislatively. Did I say that properly? Legislatively. 10 times fast. In order to become a Saudi citizen, a resident must aggregate at least 23 qualifying points in addition to a number of factors such as Arabic language fluency, not just proficiency but fluency. Living in Saudi Arabia for a decade gives the applicant 10 points. A bachelor's degree equates to 5 points, while a master's degree counts for 8 points. Thereafter, an applicant for citizenship can be filed. Nevertheless, for all involved, citizenship or naturalization continues to be an extremely sensitive issue. In Bahrain again, for example, a large portion of the security forces consist of naturalized Sunnis from Pakistan and elsewhere. Rosamund de Sibel, the Middle East and Africa editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, says, although hard to prove, there is a widespread belief among Bahraini Shia that the government has fast-tracked citizenship for Sunni expatriates in order to alter the country's demographic balance. So demographic engineering. De Sibel says Kuwait, meanwhile, has made some progress towards solving the citizenship status of its 100,000 plus stateless Bidun. In 2011, the central system for remedying the status of illegal residents was set up to solve the issues within 5 years. And they are far from solved, although the body is far from achieving its goal. As of March 2013, the National Assembly passed legislation granting 4,000 Bidun citizenship. Their rate of naturalization is likely to improve in the next few years as the issue is pushed in Parliament and attracts the attention of international human rights organizations such as ourselves. For most Gulf governments, though, there are a number of compelling reasons to keep the status quo in place. Perhaps top on the list is whether they could afford to spread the generous benefits that obedient GCC citizens enjoy. In recent decades, the living standards of Gulf residents has risen dramatically, and for citizens this has typically meant receiving heavily subsidized housing, education, healthcare and energy. Qatar and UAE both rank in the top 10 per capita incomes in the world, with Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Oman ranking in the top 30 according to the think tank Chatham House. I again quote to Sibyl here, who says, Gulf governments will resist adding further pressure to public finances. They are also trying to engineer ways of reversing the private sector's reliance on cheaper foreign labour, encouraging citizens to take up positions normally occupied by foreigners. Against this backdrop, wholesale reform of citizenship rules is unlikely. Governments are also facing another major problem, the pushback from locals. Nationals in the GCC states are concerned that granting foreigners citizenship will dilute their traditions, culture and national identity, which is already under pressure from an influx of foreign labour. Here there is a revealing insight into the relationship between nationals and their governments. The minority local populations at times feel uncertain and insecure over their national identity and entrust the ruling elite with the responsibility of upholding a sense of national identity. Migration does tend to attract the high risk, especially in countries such as Bahrain and Oman, where the wage gap is lower and nationals are sometimes competing for the same private sector jobs as migrants. How much for time?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to leave my paper aside. And I'm just going to talk very quickly about the challenges that are faced by people who have been expelled from Bahrain specifically, and Saudi Arabia, who are living in the UK and in Ireland. They are so lost, having had their citizenship revoked by their countries, their nationality revoked. They have no access to their families, they have no money, they are living on the whim of the state. They are segregated into camps hundreds and hundreds of miles away from stronger cities and the resources that come with a more diverse demographic. And the people who are trying to make them welcome in their villages have really no education, cultural education or ethnic education to help to support them. There's no, you know, when you go into a grocery shop and you're looking at tins and you have no idea what's actually in the tin, it's very hard for a woman to be able to figure out how she's going to cook something that's palatable for her children to eat. So it's just, I don't have enough time to go into it. But from a socio-economic perspective, I've done my best in the short time allowed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. That was very useful. Would like now to play a video. Enjoy watching.
الحقوقي المزري والمأساوي في دول الخليج اهتمامات المنظمات الحقوقية الدولية وتقاريرها الدولية الزاخرة بارتكابات حكومات تلك الدول بحق مواطنيها. واقع يقتصر على غياب فضاء الحرية بكل أشكالها وتغليب ممارسة الديمقراطية لغير هيمنة الأحكام الملكية التسلطية يدخل كل جوانب الحياة في تلك الدول ويكشف عن غربة حقيقية بينها وبين شعوبها. انتهاكات متشابهة وآثار اضطهاد موحدة تنتهجها الحكومات الخليجية دفعت باتجاه حساب علاقة تلك الدول بمواطنيها وإبقائها علاقة تبعية بدلا من علاقة مناظرة ومشاركة في صنع السياسة والقرار الوطني. توقيفات اعتراضية، إعلانات عشوائية ومحاكمات غير قانونية واسعة في البحرين والكويت وقطر والسعودية وعمان والإمارات. محاكمات لا تطال المواطنون المطالبين بالإصلاح فقط، بل النواب وحتى الناشطين والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان. ولم يستثنيها محامين وإعلاميين وكتاب وأدباء ومثقفين وحتى مغردين ومدونين، ما يعكس مدى خشية حكومات تلك الدول من كل رأي يطرح في العالم أو تجمع سلمي للتعبير عن الاحتجاج والرفض لقرارات السلطة المركزية. رغم ذلك لم تعترف حكومات دول الخليج يوما بأننا تشهده من حالات ومطالب شعبية على سلميتها ليست سوى نتاج سياساتها الخاطئة، وإنها تندرج في سياق النضال السلمي لحقوق الإنسان، بقدر تحاول دائما تشبيه أي حراك حقوقي بوصفه بالإرهاب تارة أو تصويره بأنه مشروع تخريبي قادم من الخارج. وقد تصنيعت لها تصنيفات المنظمات الدولية، وسرعان ما يتكشف لنا موقع دول الخليج القابعة دوما في رأس القوائم المنتهكة لحقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية، جراء تخوفها عن إجراء إصلاحات جذرية جدية لبنيان أنظمتها، فضلا عن ابتعادها عن موائمة تشريعاتها مع الشرع والمواثيق الحقوقية الدولية، وامتناعها عن منح مواطنيها قدرا من المواطنة وشكلا من أشكال الحرية والممارسة الديمقراطية. واقع يبدو مألوفا وطبيعيا إذا ما علمنا أن تلك الدول تعتبر من أقل دول العالم مسابقة على الاتفاقيات والمواثيق الحقوقية الدولية.
I believe I won't have to add on the video, but the key demand of the Arab uprisings is a transition from being subjects to being citizens. This captures a sense of a desired end to perceived passivity and a claim to becoming a different sort of political being respected with dignity and rights. We will now hear inputs from our speaker Abdelbaki Jibril from Darfur Relief and Documentation Center.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. In my brief intervention, I will try to highlight the situation of non-citizens. And I think from this film, we have just seen how citizens have been treated in the Gulf countries. Then you can imagine the treatment meted out to non-citizens. First of all of us agree that citizenship, in fact, is a precondition for the enjoyment of human rights, all human rights. The first that comes to mind is the enjoyment of civil and political rights, and it's correct, which is not questioned even in some societies. Yet there is a very important category also that non-citizens were really deprived of, and this is economic, social, and cultural rights, specifically in the Gulf countries, where people really do not fully enjoy those rights. And of course in many other societies, these rights are not fully enjoyed by non-citizens. As Sudanese of origin, and Sudan has a very large community of expatriates working in the Gulf countries, thousands of them, if not millions. Some of them stayed for so long, over 40 years, 50 years, and still they live as budun, as you have said, and non-citizens, and even their descendants who have nothing to do with Sudan and cannot just go back, but anyway they are still there, stranded. They can do no good to themselves or to their country of origin. They cannot even move freely. I will, before going really further on this, allow me, Madam Chair, to bring to your attention also a case that really deserves some attention and highlights. It's also concerned with a country that is also called an Arab country, Sudan. And then I will come later. I want to elaborate more on the Gulf countries. Sudan has created a situation of statelessness for thousands of its citizens. And that was really willingly by the government, and it was quite very recent, no, I think people don't know much about it, but it is important that I just bring it very quickly to your attention. When Sudan was split into two, that is Sudan and Republic of South Sudan, then the government in Khartoum immediately amended the Sudan Nationality Act in a very discriminatory way, with one purpose: to strip people originating from South Sudan from their right to citizenship in the north. And even the amendment to the law is very problematic and very discriminatory, doesn't give any chance to people to challenge it or protect their rights. And there are so many victims of that. Like the rest of the Arab countries, fatherhood is the so-called, the basis for citizenship in Sudan. So if your father is Sudanese, then you are Sudanese. But in Sudan, that was not the case. When they amended the law, they made it very clear that any individual that was born to a South Sudanese father, whether his mother is Sudanese or from the north, or not, he is to be deprived of his nationality, given that he acquired the nationality of South Sudan de jure or de facto. And this is just absolute rubbish, because there are so many people who never applied for citizenship of South Sudan, who didn't even vote even for separation of the country into two, but they were collectively deprived of their right to citizenship. And of course, there are so many other conditions set on such people. And here we have really created a situation of statelessness for thousands of people, Sudanese, in fact, of origin, born in Sudan and lived all their lives in Sudan, but now they find themselves can't do nothing. And they live in Khartoum, they live in Medina, they have their properties there, they have nowhere to go to anywhere. And one example is, a very interesting example, by the way, what has to say it, a gentleman called Adil Burai. The father or the grandfather of this gentleman is a Sudanese national hero, in fact. He fought against the British. He is the first Sudanese to take up arms and to fight against the British when Sudan was a colony of Britain at that time. And that was in 1942. He was killed by the British. And a song, a national song in Sudan, was really, where his name, the name of that gentleman, the grandfather of this Adil, is honored. And we all sing it, proudly so. Yet, now Mr. Adil and his family, they face a difficulty of being a Sudanese because that Sudanese hero who was killed by the British finds his origin in the south of Sudan. So he was told that you cannot be a Sudanese because your grandfather comes from South Sudan. Can you imagine? Anyway, he didn't give up. He fought until the Supreme Court, and just 2 days ago, that is Monday, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, because luckily his mother originates from the north of Sudan. So now there is a ruling, and he can still fight with the executive to get his rights restored. And I tell you frankly, me and so many other activists and Sudanese at large, they just cannot understand how a government willingly creates such a crisis for its citizens. Here, government really have no choice, and Sudanese government is not alone, but there are so many other governments. We have to look at the whole picture. Some governments, they have their concerns. I fully can understand why, for example, in the Gulf countries, it is very hard to get the right to citizenship after so many years in the service of that society in those countries. And I think time will not allow us to elaborate on these fears, whether these are based on reality or they are baseless, whether there are real fears or these are imaginary fears. However, we have a problem, a human rights problem, a massive problem, violations of basic rights of people that have to be addressed. And we have to think of an inventive way of trying to find a solution which can really help those people or those victims to restore their rights, and also to make those governments where such kind of large communities of bidun or stateless persons understand the benefit those countries can really gain when such people, get documented and they have their situations regulated. Because at the end of the day, this is a real power, a real force. And one of the examples that I have to say, when the people of South Sudan were chased away, then we faced very serious difficulties, because most of those people, they work in construction building, for example, in farms, etc., etc. So farmers found themselves in a situation where there is no people to help them, harvest their crop. Construction also stopped in some sites because there is no labor. It's very simple like that. So these are, Madam, do you have still some time or finish?
I think their time is finished.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Anyway, I hope I was in line with you.
Yeah, thank you, Abdel Baqi. It is a very sad situation in Sudan as well.
Right.
To let some time for our last speaker, we'd like to hear from Mohammed Sultan, member of Bahrain Center for Human Rights. So he tells us more also on the situation in Bahrain.
Hello everyone, thanks for being here today. In Bahrain, since 2012, after the pro-democracy uprising in 2011, revoking citizenships has been used as a method of intimidation against human rights defenders, journalists, and active members of civil societies. In 2017, between January 1st and May 21st, 21 individuals have had their Bahraini citizenship revoked in politically motivated cases, rendering them stateless. In October 2017, 26 individuals have been stripped of their citizenship, and this just during 3 consecutive days. In the last 4 years, over 350 Bahrainis have been rendered stateless. This systemic policy does not only violate international convention violating citizens' right to maintain their nationalities, but also neglects the humanitarian implication of such conduct. Stateless individuals in Bahrain have not recognized right and their ability to obtain and retain housing, employment, legal representation, banking facilities, and medical aid are all severely restricted. Moreover, in recent years, cases of children of oppositions denied nationality documents were frequently reported. It appears as a means to place pressure on the wanted father to submit themselves for arrest on an increased punishment for those already arrested by refusing to issue documents confirming the nationality of the child or ID documents. The state increases the pressure placed of this family. Bahrain Center for Human Rights have verified a total of 13 cases where children have been denied citizenship document by Bahraini authorities. These children were born between 2013 and 2016. This even more alarming when one considers the discriminatory Bahraini law that does not allow women to pass down their nationality to their children. The arbitrary revocation of citizenships had grave consequences, making the concerned individual target to abuse due to lack of legal status, and this lack of protection by the law. They cannot give power of attorney to lawyer to log appeals on their behalf, and they are under daily threat of being deported from the only country they ever knew. All the checkpoints around Bahrain, stateless person always encounter difficulty when asked for their IDs at checkpoints. As a result, some of them are transferred to police station and treated like criminals. This arbitrary revocation of citizenship is a violation of international law. It is a violation of Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to nationality, and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right of change his nationality. Based on this, we therefore call for the international community to put pressure on Bahrain government to reinstate the nationality for all those whose citizenships was arbitrarily revoked on politically motivated ground since 2011, and to end the use citizenship revocation as a tool to punish political opposition and strip individuals of this basic human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. We have 10 minutes for final remarks and questions and short comments from the audience. Whoever would like to speak, please let us know. Ahmed? Yes, please go ahead, just openly.
Yeah. As human rights defenders, I think that we should assure that human rights are respected in every country, that no one is left behind, that we should stand by with human rights violations. And unfortunately, we are standing by in Western Sahara, where human rights are violated continuously. People are being tortured, imprisoned, and even murdered only for being Sahrawis and fighting for the right to self-determination.
Thank you. Anyone else? I see no hands. So I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for all of their valuable inputs, and also for the respected audience for engaging with us today. And we would like to see you in our other events during this council session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.